In this lesson, we're going to look at the tools you need to develop CSS3 transformations and animations. Now first, you need a web browser. Actually, that's not quite true. As a good web developer, you need as many browsers as you can get your hands on. And ideally, you need to have the latest versions because CSS3 animations simply aren't supported in older browsers. Now this usually isn't a huge problem. If an older browser fails to handle a CSS property, it simply won't be applied. Now the user may not see the animated effect, but the page remains functional. Now there are a few occasions where you need to be careful about backward compatibility, but we'll cover those situations when they arise. Now throughout most of these lessons, I'm going to be using Firefox, which is my preferred browser. It's available on all platforms and you can download it from getfirefox.com. You should also grab a copy of Google Chrome from google.com/Chrome. Now Chrome is currently the world's most used web browser and it's available for all OSs. But if you're not a big fan of Google, then you could try Opera. Now this is available from opera.com. Opera uses the same rendering engine as Chrome, so there's rarely a need to test both. Now if you're using a Mac, then you'll have Safari installed. It's also the browser present on the iPhone, iPad and iPod. Now Safari will render similarly to Chrome, although they are diverging slightly. Finally, if you're on Windows 7 or 8, you can use Internet Explorer 10 or above. If you've got an older version installed, use the Windows Update or head over to microsoft.com/IE. Now IE doesn't have a great reputation, but IE 10 is a good browser which has caught the competition. And it's the first version to support animations. Don't bother trying any of these examples in earlier editions because they simply won't work. Now all the browsers offer developer consoles, which can be very useful when debugging CSS3. Most can be accessed by choosing appropriate menus, right-click Context Options, pressing Ctrl-Shift-I on Windows, Command-Option-I on Mac, or F12. Now I'm going to inspect this element by choosing the right-click menu. And I can dynamically change this font size just by entering a new property value here, and you can see it's changed. You can even do some amazing things, such as viewing the layout in 3 dimensions. Now some of the more recent browsers even allow you to edit your code directly in the application. But I would always recommend using a dedicated text editor or integrated development environment. Now there are plenty to choose from, and in these examples, I'm going to be using Notepad++ on Windows, which is free and available from notepad-plus-plus.org. But it really doesn't matter whether you're using Visual Studio, TextMate, Sublime, Eclipse or NetBeans. Use whatever you're comfortable with, since you'll be spending many hours with that application. But I will offer a few tips. Make sure it's fast. There's nothing more frustrating than a slow editor. You'll also need to open multiple files at a time, so tabs, such as this, or a multiple document interface is essential. Your editor also needs to support multiple languages, and definitely HTML and CSS. Line numbering, as we see here, is essential, especially when you're finding errors at specific locations. Color coding can save hours of time because it highlights when you haven't closed a quote or a bracket. Autocomplete can also be useful and will save many hours. And finally, session store and restore. When I close my editor, I want all my files to appear in the same way they did the next time I launch it. Now there are a couple of other tools you might find useful. The first is a web server such as Apache or IIS. It's certainly not essential for this course since all the files will run directly from the file system. However, if you're serious about developing web applications, you will require a web server at some point. Next, we have CSS preprocessors such as Less, Sass, and Stylus. Now these have become very popular during the past few years, because they allow you to use a more concise CSS syntax, which is translated to real CSS code before it's loaded by the browser. Now this is certainly useful for vendor prefixes. Some of the CSS properties we're using are considered to be experimental. In other words, they haven't reached W3C recommendation status, and they might change at some point in the future. but I would say that most are stable and perfectly safe to use. But to ensure there's no compatibility issues, vendors add a prefix to the start of the property. So for example, if we consider something as simple as border radius,